Welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 4, Episode 4. I'm Jenna Jandreau, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Season 4 of Chebacco Chats is sponsored by Machias Savings Bank. We are grateful for their continued support of our exhibits and programs. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format, so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to use the chat to reach out to us with comments or questions, or to chat with other participants in the webinar. Today, I'm speaking to Patrick Callaway about Nova Scotian preoccupation, 1713 to 1762, or why not MDI? Patrick is a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Maine and the University of Maine at Farmington, where he is Zooming from today. Along with working as the collections manager at the MDI Historical Society, he writes the column From the Collections for our newsletter, The Society Pages, and is also a Chebacco author. Patrick earned his Ph.D. in Canadian American history at the University of Maine and was a Fulbright exchange student at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Thank you for being here, Patrick.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm going to start our chat today by asking this topic that we're getting into, preoccupation with Nova Scotia during this era. Where did your story or your research about this get started? Where did this story come from?
Well, there's two branches that come into this. So the first was actually inspired by an earlier issue of Chebacco, when we were asking the question of what if and questions of alternative histories of just a couple of things perhaps would have gone a different direction and what that might have meant for the course of history on MDI and for the region. The second origin of this is that my primary research is on agriculture and Nova Scotia and trade with Nova Scotia. So this fills in part of the gap that I was trying to research in my own academic career, taking a look at how do we transition from an Acadian landscape to a very heavily settled New England planter landscape in a relatively short period of time in Nova Scotia history.
So I'm going to share my screen. We've put together a slideshow of some images to go with your chat today. And while I'm doing that, let's get started in on the topic. So I guess kind of settle us into the era and the place. We're talking about early 1700s and Nova Scotia. I'm gonna share my screen and let's dive in.
Okay, so the real question that I was trying to drive at here, or trying to figure out here, is why do we have such a gap in time between early English explorations along the mid-coast and settlement on MDI? So we have an English fur trading post in what is now present-day Castine as early as 1626, but as we're all familiar with, Soames and his crew do not arrive until 1762. So what accounts for this time gap of almost 130 to 140 years when other colonial explorations and settlements are moving much more quickly? If we're looking at the 17th century, so through the earlier colonial era, through King William's War and through Queen Anne's War, a very important part of this is Native American resistance. Those two wars do not go well for English colonial interest in what will become Maine, so that is part of the picture. However, particularly Queen Anne's War goes very well for New England interest and for English interest in the Acadian colony that will later become called Nova Scotia. So this is part of that trend of explaining, well, why not MDI? Part of it is resistance, and that is significant to remember. But part of it is that there were just other opportunities that were available that were considered to be more significant or perhaps more immediately profitable than settling along the middle of the Maine coast and on MDI.
So you're referencing Acadian region, but it's not Acadia National Park. If some people may recognize that sound of word. So we're going to get into, I think, a little bit about the Acadians in Nova Scotia as you go through your talk, but it is a separate region from Acadia National Park and not having to do with MDI. Clarifying point for some folks. So I'm going to start our first slide here.
All right. Usually Acadian is usually the people. Acadia is the colony. Acadia National Park is 20th century, something that's after my time.
Yes, exactly. And I tend to default pronounce Acadian because I'm in a region of Acadians, and my beginning in history, I guess, as work was in my undergrad years. I worked at the Acadian archives, and we always called it the Archives Acadiennes. And so I always have this difficulty adjusting my translate or my pronunciation. So are we looking at the region Acadia right now?
Yes. So the map
Okay.
on the screen, this is roughly 1700. We'll see a couple of areas of intense settlement. So we'll see it up around Grand Pré and up through there. The one that we're really interested, though, at this point in time is Port Royal. So this is going to be that area of settlement that we will see a real conflict between English and New England troops and French colonial interests break out in a systemic way. So Port Royal was the capital of the French colony of Acadia. So this is where we are going to find the center of administration and the center of political authority within the colony. So when war breaks out, Queen Anne's War breaks out, this is going to be a target for the English, particularly New Englanders, who see Acadia as a potential threat not only to settlements along the coast, but more directly as a potential threat to the North Atlantic fisheries. So the fishing banks that are off the coast of New England, off the coast of the maritime provinces of Canada, and moving up towards Newfoundland are a very significant economic resource. So they see French settlement as a potential threat to that. So if they're looking for a reason, that's going to be the economic reasons that we see for an attack on Port Royal. The other is that they see the potential for territorial expansion. So there is relatively rich land available in the Port Royal vicinity and a little bit further up the coast as well. So this is going to be the economic incentive for the events that we'll see play out.
And you can see, in addition to Port Royal being identified on this map here, the Ile Mont Desert, which might be familiar to some. That's the Mount Desert Island, little kind of lobster claw shape right there. So this is a map of Port Royal, 1710, which I really enjoyed looking at in more detail. And I'll always love reading old handwriting, the beautiful script that they are writing in this era. So tell me a little bit about this map.
Okay, so this is the military map of an attack put together by a guy by the name of Colonel Francis Nicholson in 1710. So the idea was that colonial interests were deeply interested in Acadia, imperial interests not so much. So what the English colonies, particularly the New England colonies, decided to do was that they would launch their own military expedition against this French colony. They decide to attack Port Royal because that is the political center, and we see this beautiful map laid out of the military expedition. If you are in the Annapolis Royal area, you'll see a variation of this fort still on the landscape. It's very nicely done, part of Parks Canada now. But what we see here is the location along the river routes, so transportation. And if we look very closely towards the north part of the map, we'll see where the English troops and colonial troops dug in. So this was a siege that lasts several weeks, potentially could have failed at any given point. But militarily, the French were isolated. If British imperial authorities had little interest in the colony, French imperial authorities had even less. So they were out on their own. After a siege of several weeks, the colony surrenders. So the interesting part here is that it is a New England operation against a French colony, alongside but not necessarily under the auspices of imperial authority. So this is a colonial war started by colonials. So now we're
Okay.
jumping. No, go
Isn't
ahead.
this the most beautiful map you've ever seen? I love the inclusion of flora and fauna, I guess you could say. So we have Halifax.
Yes, this will be the introduction of Halifax. So Halifax is a really interesting place in that it is the only colonial settlement that was directly sponsored and funded by the British government in all of colonial history.
Wow.
Part of the problem that they had was, even though Port Royal had been taken over, even though Nova Scotia had been ceded to the British in 1713, there were very few English settlers there. The population was primarily either First Nations or French Acadian, and there was a very deep concern over the loyalty of those populations towards the British Crown, and probably rightfully so. British administration was not always, well, enlightened is an abusive term, but they were not always skillful in their operations. And there was a real fear that even the slightest hint of an uprising would cause the collapse of the entire colony. What would go with that was that concern over the fisheries and over naval control. So the best harbor along the east shore of Nova Scotia is Halifax, or what will become Halifax. It was almost named Dunkville, of all places. It's a Yeah, Halifax is Lord Halifax's title. His family name was Dunk, so it almost got named Dunkville.
Well, I think
Which,
Halifax has a nicer ring to it personally. Okay, so
yeah. So what
everything on
happened?
this map is some of it is it a British map? Is it a French map? Who was the creator of this? Do you know?
So this is going to be British military engineering.
Okay,
So a lot of the place names like Chebacco, those are going to be transliterations of Native American terms.
got it.
So and spelling at this time gets a little hit or miss. But the significance here is not only the British government involvement, but the scope and the scale. So we are looking at a settlement that was originally designed for 2,000 to 2,500 immigrants from Europe to Nova Scotia in order to establish the space of imperial control and stronger control over the colony. We will see other immigrations to places like Lunenburg, which was settled by Germans with an allegiance to George II. But the concept here is that it's an urban settlement that is being created in order to provide a population base for English rule over Nova Scotia, not only for those external reasons of a military base and the fisheries, but also to start counterbalancing Native American and French Acadian settlement within the colony. So it's basically a type of counter settlement under British government auspices designed to repopulate the colony with more loyal populations. And it's incredibly expensive, but that's an investment that the British government's willing to make just this once.
Now, were French, like Acadian and First Nations uprisings exclusive, or did they ever band together against the British? Was there a potential for that that was also a fear for them?
There was a potential of it. The First Nations and Mi'kmaq and the Acadian were intermarried for multiple generations. For British officials, they conflated the two almost completely. One was the other, and both were seen as potentially disloyal, and both were seen as potential servants of the French crown. So, to the British officials, one in many ways was the other.
Something to be concerned about, in their opinion.
Yes.
I love this man's portrait. Everybody, please meme this. No, this is Charles Lawrence. And what is he related to Halifax, or what is his part of this story?
Okay, so he is the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia in 1755, and he has some pretty interesting ideas on how the colony should be run. His idea is that if you're worried about the loyalty of the Acadian, why not deport them? Well, prior to 1755, there really was no move for that. That would require a number of resources from the imperial government, from the colonial government, and there just was not support for that. The status of the Acadian under British law was a little uncertain. Part of the Oath of Allegiance was a recognition of the Protestant succession and an allegiance to George II as the head of the English Church. And there's a great deal of dispute over whether or not that Oath of Allegiance with that clause had been taken. Lawrence seizes on this and makes the claim that not only are they foreign aliens, which is kind of a modern term, but they can be deported without recourse to British law. In 1755, another series of fighting breaks out in the region. So this will be known as the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War in American histories. And he sees this as an opportunity because there is a number of regiments of New England militia within Nova Scotia, and there is a support from British officials, at least tacitly, to use those resources to solve what they see to be as a problem. So drawing on the example of the Highland clearances that we see in Scotland going back into the 1740s, they see this potentially disloyal population as something that can be removed. So to put a modern term on it, and this is not a term they would have used, essentially the solution to potential disloyalty is ethnic cleansing. Remove those populations from the colony so they cannot cause any problems.
If you'll notice, my cheeks might get more red as we start talking about this, because this is something a little near and dear to my heart, considering as we go into this a little bit more, we talk about deportation. This is a story that's very familiar to the people in the St. John Valley, which is where I'm zooming in from. So if I look like I'm getting physically animated in my brain, it's because I certainly kind of am. So let's talk about the deportation. Or how is it said? Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Deportation.
Right. So 1755 rolls along, and there is a policy that is approved that allows for the deportation of the Acadian. Well, part of the reason is that national security interest, quote unquote, but part of it is that there is a keen interest in the Acadian farmland. So we see a pretty good artist rendition here. So of haying, this would be probably around the Grand Pré region, based on the diking and the color of the soil. But a very rich, potentially significant agricultural settlement that would have supported hay, wheat, apples, all sorts of crops that 18th century English settlers would be interested in. This gets the particular attention of people in New England. So people who are in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New England in particular, who see this as a potential opportunity. Rather than moving inland to potentially questionable lands, or moving inland to places where fighting with Native Americans is much more fierce and much more part of the context, why not take a look at some of these farmlands which have been largely cleared, which are very rich bottom soils, which have been farmed now for generations and proven to be fertile and effective? Why not pick that up? Over on the right, we see the last in this series of paintings. The guy on the horse is actually Colonel John Winslow, who is the head of the Massachusetts militia. Remember that most of these soldiers that Lawrence is sending out are New England militia. And not only are they out there for these military purposes, they also have a very keen eye for the landscape and a very keen eye on potential economic opportunities that might come to them now that these lands have been, quote, vacated, as they put it in the writings of the time. Kind of an interesting use of the word, but that is their terminology, is that now that the Acadian have been vacated, this potentially opens up opportunities for them to settle.
And you brought up the fertile farmlands, and I have learned through my own Acadian research that they had developed or learned those techniques for developing river lands into fertile farmlands when they were in France and brought those over with them, the Acadian French. And so it was something to really want, like you said. It was a fertile paradise, a great resource. So they vacated people. Where did the Acadian population wind up?
Some of them ended up going back to France. Many of them were scattered throughout the colonies. About half or so that survive end up in the French colony of Louisiana. So Acadian and Cajun are the draw off of the same population root, and Cajun is actually a derivative of Acadian. So that's where a lot of them go. To jump forward in the story, there was a second attempted deportation in 1762, and a shipload of Acadian from Nova Scotia were sent to Boston, and the Massachusetts legislature refused to let them land. So they were sent back to Nova Scotia.
Yes, and there were also a huge portion of them that died while they were on board these ships. Families were also separated and put on board different ships and went to different places. So it was, as you said, kind of ethnic cleansing in one way or the other. So I'm going to move on past this slide. This is, oh, okay, I know what this is. This is like not a great proclamation. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So with those populations, quote unquote, vacated, what do you do with the land now? Because with the farmers off of it, it's really just land. So Charles Lawrence decides that he's going to put some ads out in the newspaper in colonial North America. So we see these ads in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and a couple in Pennsylvania, where he is offering free land in Nova Scotia if people will immigrate there to settle it. He's also offering some other incentives. He's offering tax breaks, he's offering transportation, he's offering subsidies for things like surveying, and in a clause that actually gets him in trouble with the British government later on, he promises the settlers food for the first 18 to 24 months if they will move there and settle. Now, that is actually disallowed by the British government a little bit later on. Lawrence himself actually dies before the accounts are settled. But this is for the context of the time, this is an absolutely sweetheart deal being offered by the colonial government, because not only is it land and freehold land, there's also various economic subsidies being provided to encourage people to come to Nova Scotia rather than to pursue other opportunities that might have been available either in Maine or elsewhere on the North American frontier. So working back sort of to our question of, well, why not the Maine coast? Why not MDI? This is going to be a very rational economic decision that people are making at the time. They can go to Nova Scotia where there's free land, open farmland has been settled, bottomlands, and economic subsidies, or they can cut a deal with Francis Bernard and go to MDI. So there's a choice to be made there.
And he was, I remember from a previous Chebacco chat, working on establishing a settlement of a German population in Southwest Harbor. So he had his own he had his own things going on. So this last slide that we have is a memorial plaque, and I believe this is in Nova Scotia. I see Canada emblazoned on there. So is this at the site of the fort that you told me about earlier?
This is going to be one of the plaques there. So the fort in Annapolis Royal. That's either going to be that one or this will be the fort at Windsor. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a similar plaque at both of them, as Minas is going to be up towards modern day Windsor. This is an interesting one because when we think of settlement and the movement of populations, when we think of the mid-coast of Maine, when we think of MDI, we are used to talking in terms of a handful of families. In the case of Nova Scotia, we are talking about thousands of people. So over the span of about 7 to 8 years, we see the immigration of somewhere around 8,000 people from New England, mostly Massachusetts and Connecticut, to Nova Scotia. Again, that deal that Lawrence and then his successors as the lieutenant governors of Nova Scotia are willing to make with them to come settle there is just a better deal than what they're going to get on MDI from Francis Bernard. The prospects were much better. The farming landscape was potentially much better. And there were certain concessions made on things like taxes that persisted moving forward. So why not MDI? They were making a rational economic choice that they were going to pursue another opportunity in Nova Scotia that was based in part on the military experiences years before, based in part on their own observations, but based in part on what they thought that would be in their own best interest. So why not MDI? Why take the chance if there is another option?
So at this time, before, I guess, settlers of European descent arrived in their boats in Somme Sound, as we hear these great stories, what was happening on MDI before Abraham Soames, while everyone was preoccupied with Nova Scotia? There must have been Wabanaki presence.
Well, certainly. There's Wabanaki presence at the time and persisting still. From the colonial perspective, there isn't a whole lot going on, because if we look at the development of the Middle Maine coast, we're seeing the development of places like a Fort Pownall and places like that as late as 1759 and 1760. So that move up the coast was, even in the context of the 7 Years' War, much, much slower, in part, again, to local resistance, but in part because people decided to go to Nova Scotia instead, because one of the provisions made was that there was a guarantee of government protection from the British government and from the Nova Scotia colonial government in a way that Massachusetts just could not match in this region.
So after thousands of people immigrated to Nova Scotia, then they ended up being able to move to other areas that weren't giving them such a sweet deal, maybe like MDI. So around what time did Abraham Soames arrive? Was that in the 1780s?
Abraham Soames, no, that's the 1762 story we're familiar
That is
with.
1762. Okay, my goodness. Okay, so Francis Bernard is also at the same time as you mentioned in Southwest Harbor era. And they, okay, so they were actually trekking around together. Soames was a kind of a guide for Bernard. It's all coming back to me. So this was really, I didn't expect when we had talked earlier about having this Chebacco chat. It's not about a article that is already existing in Chebacco. So I was new a bit to this topic, but then when I found out what it was a little bit more about, I was like, oh, I know about this a little bit from the Acadian side. So I do welcome our audience members to put any questions that they may have in the chat. Patrick, I have a question for you about what's next? In the world of history, or I guess probably any research-oriented slice of life, you get stuck on things that, or find things that you didn't know of interest while you're doing your research. So where are you heading? In what direction are you heading in now?
So the next thing I'm working on is an article on 1762 Nova Scotia, as I just had a paper accepted to the Association of Canadian Studies in the United States. And what it's going to be on is 1762 Nova Scotia. The context is that a small French expedition shows up in Newfoundland, of all places, and takes the place over. And in the government archives in Nova Scotia, there is this great about 4-month panic over could the colony survive if it's attacked. So despite all of these mass waves of planters coming in, there's very few troops, there's very few weapons. Most of the military equipment in the colony is either in too poor of condition to use or is spread out all over the colony. And there's a very real fear that the whole colony and the whole scheme could collapse if pushed just a little. So what I'm looking at is that what does that tell us about the state of the colony and of the state of its government?
So this paper's been accepted. Do you have a publication date with that acceptance, or?
Well, hopefully it'll be published. The conference isn't until the end of November, so it'll probably be into next year by the time it's in final draft.
Great. Well, you keep us updated so we can share that on our social media pages. I have not received any questions, Patrick, so I do thank you for being with us on Chebacco Chats this evening. And we will have you back again to talk about future Chebacco articles, upcoming research of yours, and of course, great things in the MDI Historical Society's collection. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So coming up on Chebacco Chats next Thursday, March 30th at 4:30 p.m., we welcome back Julia Gray to talk about her article, Risk and Reward, Cranberry Isles in the Age of Sail, from the forthcoming edition of Chebacco, the Maritime Edition. Life on the Cranberry Isles has always revolved around the sea. Julia's fascinating article covers everything from coasting and transatlantic voyages to fishing, shipbuilding, and more. The chat will focus on how her research pulled together into this overview look. Julia Gray has worked in museums for more than 20 years and currently leads the Wilson Museum in Castine as their executive director. Chebacco Chats are available to view on our website the week after they air. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at MDI History to be notified when we upload them. We are currently seeking feedback on this web series, so please visit our Chebacco Chats page and take a survey. It's only a few minutes and we would really appreciate it. The new Chebacco is currently in production and will be delivered to members' mailboxes in late April. You can become a member or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org.